set up in here in preparation for bad weather outside, which is unfortunate because it's the first great fall day so far. But this is a nice space too. So to introduce myself, I'm David Pratt. I'm a professor of film and media studies, currently at VCU, often also at William & Mary, which is where I got my PhD in American Studies in 2017. My dissertation was on American detective fiction, which obviously poet plays a role in, and specifically the sort of metaphorical, symbolic role of drinking in detective fiction throughout the 20th century. It's a fun topic, yeah. But more generally, my academic interests, or one of my field of academic interests, is the role of alcohol in American political, social, and cultural life. And it comes up again and again in surprisingly really major ways. And another genre, in addition to hard-boiled detective fiction, where we see both the influence of things going on in the broader culture and society being reflected in fiction and other forms of media as well, but also a genre that has an effect, I would argue, on things that are going on in the political world, in the social world, is Gothic fiction and horror fiction. So I started, while working on my dissertation, this was sort of an offshoot of it, looking at Gothic fiction and alcoholism, beginning with The Shining, but also, of course, referring back to Poe, since he lived at a very interesting time for changes in drinking mores in American culture, and incorporated those things into his writing. But yeah, starting specifically looking at The Shining, starting with the book, I've just begun to think about the movie as well, which we can talk about after my talk, because I think it is very interesting how different it is in the way it portrays drinking in relationship to Jack Torrance's torment in the story. So, to begin, in his memoir On Writing, published in 2000, Stephen King echoes many popular artists of his generation in this post-recovery assessment of his alcohol and drug use. Quote, "The idea that creative endeavor and mind-altering substances are entwined is one of the great pop intellectual myths of our time. Substance-abusing writers are just substance abusers, common garden variety drunks and druggies, in other words. Any claims that the drugs and alcohol are necessary to dull a finer sensibility are just the usual self-serving bullshit. It doesn't matter if you're James Jones, John Cheever, or a stew bum snoozing in Penn Station. For an addict, the right to the drink or drug of choice must be preserved at all costs. Hemingway and Fitzgerald didn't drink because they were creative, alienated, or morally weak. They drank because it's what alkies are wired up to do. Creative people probably do run a greater risk of alcoholism than those in some other jobs, but so what? We all look pretty much the same when we're puking in the gutter." In the 21st century, this description of alcoholism as a physical predisposition with no other motivating factors of great importance is so familiar it hardly bears articulation. But in the mid-20th century, the idea that alcoholism was an unfortunate identity lying dormant in certain people, waiting to be actualized, was still fairly novel. Alcoholics Anonymous held its first meeting in 1935, and the organization's foundational concept of the alcoholism allergy gained wide acceptance in the years after World War II. Charles Jackson's novel The Lost Weekend, published in 1944, is often considered the first major American pop culture narrative to promote AA's disease model of alcoholism. An acclaimed film adaptation followed the novel in 1945, as did many other books, films, and television dramas, which likewise helped to promote the disease model of alcoholism to the level of cultural hegemony it maintains largely to this day. However, the relationship between American popular culture and alcohol from The Lost Weekend through King's On Writing was not a simple continuing conclusion to entrench AA principles in popular thought. Films like The Days of Wine and Roses helped sustain public interest in alcoholism as a social problem through the mid-60s, but problem drinking then became a more private, individual concern in the Vietnam era of the mid-60s through the mid-70s. Alcoholics Anonymous itself grew and thrived despite scientific research challenging the disease model. But what public attention there had been on the issue of alcoholism turned to the pressing matters of racial strife, an unpopular war, and a rise in recreational drug use. In 1950, a film comedy about an alcoholic might hinge on the question of if a hallucinating alcoholic's sanity and the need to institutionalize him, as did the James Stewart vehicle Harvey. In 1970, there was no question, however, about the sanity of Hawkeye Pierce, the effortlessly talented Korean war doctor who drinks heavily in the defiance of institutions with no hallucinations and few other negative consequences in Robert Altman's film comedy MASH. By the mid-70s, though, American popular culture narratives again began treating heavy drinking more consistently as a problem. Even Hawkeye struggled with his drinking habits in later episodes of the TV incarnation of MASH, which aired on CBS from 1972 to 1983. In the post-Vietnam years, though, the specific manner in which popular culture treated alcohol-related problems changed with new public health emphasis on social concerns like drunk driving and fetal alcohol syndrome. Whereas Alcoholics Anonymous and the mid-century alcoholism movement had propagated the idea that certain people are predisposed to drinking problems and therefore require attention and public resources, in the last quarter of the 20th century, the so-called New Temperance movement re-emphasized the dangers of drink itself, rather than of specific drinkers, and tempered pity for the alcoholic as a victim of a disease with blame for the danger he posed to others. And though the author's own habits were hardly temperate at the time, Stephen King wrote the definitive popular novel for the early years of this alcoholic cultural retrenchment. By uniting the 19th century temperance narrative of a family home destroyed by a father's reckless drinking with the 20th century disease model of alcoholism through the imagery of Gothic horror, King produced an immensely successful new temperance novel in 1977 with The Shining. Even a brief summary of The Shining begins to suggest the novel's many similarities to 19th century temperance fiction. Jack Torrance, a struggling writer recently fired from his teaching position at a Vermont prep school for losing his temper with and beating a student, manages to land a job as the winter caretaker of the isolated Overlook Hotel in Colorado. Having quit drinking after drunkenly hitting an apparently riderless bicycle with his car and on another occasion breaking his son Danny's arm, Jack sees the Overlook as his last chance for redemption. However, rather than bring his family closer together and provide Jack the quiet he needs to pick up his writing again, the evil spirit-ridden Overlook plies Jack with otherworldly alcohol in its effort to weaken his will and make him kill his wife and child. The spirits nearly succeed. Jack severely beats his wife, Wendy, and corners Danny before finally taking his own life to spare his sons. Wendy and Danny barely escape the Overlook before it explodes due to Jack's failure to maintain the hotel's cantankerous boiler. By way of comparison, since most of us these days don't actually read 19th century temperance fiction any longer, consider Frances Dana Gage's Tales of Truth #1, a short story published in 1852 that exemplifies many of the tropes of temperance narratives in which, as scholars Deborah Rosenthal and David Reynolds put it, a miserable father batters his family physically and economically. After Jenny, a pale, skinny girl, comes to a woman's house begging for milk, the woman didactically tells her own children the story of how Jenny got to be in her present state. 12 years previous, Jenny's mother, Mary Cadwallader, married Edward Harris, a man from a well-to-do family who seemed himself to be on the way to prosperity as a lawyer. However, Edward tested his willpower by drinking socially and found his will wanting. Edward began losing clients while giving Mary more children for whom to care. The family was forced to move into a, quote, hovel on the outskirts of town, and Edward began to pawn their possessions for drinking money. After suffering delirium tremens, he finally resolved to reform his behavior and, quote, become a good father and husband. Like Jack Torrance, Edward Harris takes his family, quote, to a far-off western village to begin his reformation. All goes well until Edward is offered the position of barkeeper. Quote, Mary warned, begged, prayed, but all in vain. He had already tasted, and the demon was within, end quote. Over time, Edward is again overtaken by that demon. Thoroughly dissipated, he dies by falling face first into an icy puddle on the way home from the tavern, and thus drowning. After his death, Mary and her 3 surviving children, of finally 5 total, persevere until Mary catches a life-threatening cold. Tales of Truth number 1, in short, tells a story very similar to that of The Shining. An alcoholic father struggles to provide and care for his family against his desire to drink. He dramatically fails, succeeding only in doing violence to his family in the attempt. In addition to Jack, the intemperate father in King's novel, Wendy, the long-suffering wife, and Danny, the innocent child victim, both would be recognizable to Francis Gage's 19th century audience. In fact, Danny's Shining, the ability to read minds and communicate telepathically, owes a literary debt to Harriet Beecher Stowe's exceedingly precocious Little Eva, and Eva's temperance literature equivalent from T.S. Arthur's 10 Nights in a Barroom, Mary Warren. 10 Nights in a Barroom, incidentally, being a similar sentimental novel to Uncle Tom's Cabin, with a similar political purpose, towards the temperance movement rather than slavery. Also, probably the most popular stage production of the 19th century, 10 Nights in a Barroom, went on and on. The difference between The Shining and Tales of Truth number 1, of course, is that King's novel is a supernatural horror story, whereas Gage's story is entirely earthbound. However, even this difference is more superficial than it may seem. Evil ghosts provide Jack's spectral drinks at the Overlook, and the drunkard Edward is possessed, as Gage's narrator puts it, by the demon. Indeed, temperance and horror fictions have shared macabre imagery, settings, characters, and plots since the early 19th century. Here's the beach route. Edgar Allan Poe published supernatural horror stories using what David Reynolds calls the devices of dark temperance as a contemporary of and erstwhile participant in the 19th century temperance movement. In The Black Cat, published 1843, Poe's drunkard abuses and kills his beloved cat, only to be haunted by its reincarnation until he accidentally kills his wife in an attempt to kill the cat again. Though he hides his wife's body in the wall of his basement, the ghostly cat cries from within the wall to alert the police to its location. King insistently references Poe throughout The Shining, but not The Black Cat or any other of Poe's tales in the dark temperance mode. Instead, the phrase, "the Red Death held sway over all," a paraphrase of the final clause of Poe's 1842 story, The Mask of the Red Death, repeatedly appears in italics to indicate that it is running through Jack Torrance's mind. Mask of the Red Death is the story of Prince Prospero, who in the face of a devastating plague, fortifies himself in an abbey with, quote, 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court. Prospero holds a mass ball at which a clock's ominous tolling causes all attendees to pause once an hour. At the tolling of midnight, a previously unnoticed, grotesquely costumed reveler appears. He is the embodiment of the Red Death, the plague from which the abbey's inhabitants thought they were secure, but, quote, the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. King's use of a lengthy quote from Mask of the Red Death as an epigraph and his repeated references to this story about his disease infiltrating a party in the figure of a human distinguishes The Shining as not just a horror story borrowing from the dark temperance tradition, but in fact a new temperance novel for the new temperance milieu of post-Vietnam America. By repeatedly referencing the Red Death as Jack sees ghosts of Overlook partiers with increasing frequency, King suggests that the increasing threat to Jack is the inevitability of an evil, ghostly disease. By succumbing to that disease through drinking sprees with the hotel's ghosts, Jack becomes an antagonist not unlike the Max figure of Poe's tale, a human vessel bearing deadly supernatural evil. The horror of King's story is that Jack brings his family to the Overlook to protect and provide for them, but against his will, becomes a tool by which an evil force tries to destroy them, as if Prince Prospero himself became the figure of the Red Death. Directly addressing Jack's alcoholism, King states in The Shining, quote, "It had nothing to do with willpower, or the morality of drinking, or the weakness or strength of his own character. There was a broken switch somewhere inside, or a circuit breaker that didn't work, and he had been propelled down the chute willy-nilly, slowly at first, then accelerating, a big grease slide, and at the bottom had been a shattered, ownerless bicycle and a son with a broken arm. Jack Torrance in the passive mode, end quote. So, Red Death is a more apt referent than Black Cat for Jack's alcoholic mind, because the disease in Mask of the Red Death is beyond human control, just as Jack Torrance's alcoholism is apparently beyond Jack's control. Stephen King acknowledges that Jack is a victim of the disease of alcoholism, and in doing so directs the reader's focus away from his struggle with alcoholism in the form of enabling party ghosts as the potential center of the novel's action. Jack is, after all, in the passive mode. The shining central drama comes instead from Wendy's and Danny's struggle against Jack, culminating in the novel's climactic battle scene. Jack's alcoholic victimization makes him a victimizer of others who are both more vulnerable and more precious. Indeed, the mentally gifted Danny is in some ways the positive polar opposite of Jack, who is in some sense mentally diseased. Though the reader begins with sympathy for Jack as a victim of alcoholism, the reader is also relieved when Jack ultimately smashes in his own head rather than further terrorize his family. While perpetuating the disease model of alcoholism, The Shining locates the ultimate horror of alcoholism not in its threat to the alcoholic himself, but in the threat the alcoholic poses to others, particularly members of his own family. As far as my research thus far indicates, Stephen King has not explicitly acknowledged any debt The Shining owes to temperance literature, but the novel does refer to the temperance genre when Wendy, with Danny in her arms, walks in on Jack in the overlooked barroom, Colorado Lounge, where he has been imagining himself drinking his way through 20 martinis. Quote, "The three of them made a tableau that Jack felt very strongly. It was just before the curtain of Act 2 in some old-time temperance play, one so poorly mounted that the prop man had forgotten to stock the shelves of the Den of Iniquity." Though Stephen King often incorporates the literary canon successfully into his original narratives, as he does with The Mask of Red Death in The Shining, he also has a habit of making frequent off-the-cuff and somewhat superfluous literary references in his novels. King has expressed regret for being more of a writer of his time than he would like, and presumably these references to literary works with longer lives than his own are intended to give his work some added resonance. By making this particular disparaging reference to some old-time temperance play, however, King actually draws more attention to one way in which The Shining is a product of its own time. By placing Jack Torrance, a 20th century alcoholic, in a 19th century temperance narrative about the victimization of the chronic inebriate's family, The Shining tells a new temperance tale that acknowledges the alcoholic as victim, but emphasizes those whom the alcoholic victimizes. Stephen King couldn't have known it at the time, but in writing The Shining, he pushed forward the temperate cultural retrenchment that would finally make self-disgusted alcoholic confessions, like his own in On Writing, de rigueur among baby boomer pop culture elites like himself. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, when's the next lecture? I just missed it.
So,
Is there a next lecture?
not from me, anytime soon. Yes, Dean.
Was there a time when temperance referred to just not consuming liquor as opposed to just not consuming alcohol at all?
Right, yeah, so that was, of course, the original meaning of the word temperance, but it fairly quickly became a word meaning full abstinence or prohibition. But of course, early in American history, drinking beer was very common, it was a breakfast drink even. So in some sense, there was a time where it didn't mean full abstinence in as much as that wasn't necessarily possible, culturally at least. But yeah, for most of what we know as the temperance movement, it has been largely a prohibitionist movement.
Okay. Like 1830s and 40s, like post time, which I really should know, but I don't. That's why I'm asking you.
Sure, yeah, really it's, I should make that clear as well. Beginning to build up steam in the 1820s, the 1840s was probably the first high point. That's where we get groups like the Washingtonians, and figures like John B. Goff, who's one of the great orators of the 19th century, largely based on his performances, his public speeches about his past as a heavy drinker, and in which he would act out the experience of delirium tremens. So that was kind of the first high point. Then the Washingtonians had some of their own backsliding and internal scandals. John B. Goff was eventually found drunk in a tavern somewhere. But again, later in the 18th century, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a very powerful social and cultural organization in the 1870s, 1880s. And of course, finally, in the early 20th century, we got Prohibition for 14 years. So those are kind of the three peaks of the movement. And Poe was around for the first one.
What was Poe's viewpoint on all of that? Was he non-drinking? Is that what?
He was definitely not non-drinking. So he, at times, pledged abstinence. He took the pledge. And I believe he did so not long before his death for the last time. Any of you who have taken the tour here may know about Poe's relationship with his publisher, his editor here at the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, who was a temperance man, Thomas White. And he and Poe often butted heads over the fact that Poe was a heavy drinker. So much so that in one letter to Poe, Thomas White says, "No man is safe who drinks before breakfast," before indicating Poe probably drank before breakfast. But he did go through periods, like many people with drinking problems do, of abstinence followed by shorter bouts of very heavy drinking, and then would reform and go crazy again. But yeah, ultimately, throughout his life, he was not consistently a temperance man by any means.
I'm gonna go again. Sure. All right. You did say you'd say something about the movie. I know that Stephen King famously strongly disliked it.
Right.
Didn't that have something to do with alcohol? Like you didn't feel it portrayed that appropriately? I don't know.
I'm not sure about that actually. I mean, most of what I've read from him, and it's interesting, like early on, right after the movie first came out, he seemed to be pretty, or at least to speak, as if he didn't quite know how he felt about the movie yet. But as time went on, he's expressed greater and greater distaste for it. But most of what I've seen is that he's upset with it being too not exciting enough, basically. There not being enough big scares and the hotel not blowing up at the end. But one difference, I think, in terms of the way it portrays alcohol differently, is that whereas Jack Torrance in the novel really is a family man, really loves his son very much, and loves Wendy as well, and is struggling against alcohol and its sort of interference in the family unit, the Jack Torrance of the film kind of hates his family. He never really seems to be very close with either Wendy, especially not Wendy. Makes some sort of feeble claims to be close to Danny, but it doesn't really bear out in the film.